Welcome to session 4A, the State Archives Spotlight. I am overjoyed to introduce you to three of my amazing colleagues here for the State Archives for this panel. Our first presentation will be from State Agency Records Archivist Alexandra Dowry and Digital Description Archivist Caroline Waller, and they will be followed by Assistant Oral Historian Annabeth Poe. The floor is yours. Please join me in welcoming them.
Can you help me get the laptop set up? I don't need you. Where's the PowerPoint? Oh. Oh my God. Oh, there it is. Oh, sorry. Is it?
That should work.
Yeah, and then zoom this. It's,
You should be able to see your
got it here. All right, hi everyone. My name's Alexandra Dowry. I'm the State Agency Records Description Archivist, and this is Caroline Waller. She's our Digital Records Description Archivist. Today we're going to be presenting on the reprocessing of a complex legacy collection, the Treasurer and Comptroller's Papers, or TNC as we like to refer to it. Our presentation today will cover how we integrated a social history approach and conscious description as a guiding philosophy of the reprocessing project design, how we managed a large-scale and at times multi-staff reprocessing project and some of the workflows that we employed, and then the hidden histories or buried narratives that we uncovered in the process. So first, I just want to provide a little bit of background on this collection. The Treasurers and Comptrollers Papers is one of the State Archives' oldest collections and contains some of our earliest records. The main body of the records was transferred around 1920-1922 to the North Carolina Historical Commission, which was essentially the precursor to our Archives and History Department today. The collection contains records dating as early as 1682 in our Ports and Shipping Records series. It's roughly 275 cubic feet, spread throughout 44 different series. This collection was originally processed in the 1960s and described in a 261-page finding aid. It was essentially a catch-all collection for early financial papers and contains papers from the Office of the State Treasurer and the Office of the State Comptroller. And just to provide a little bit of information on these agencies, the Office of the State Comptroller was essentially the precursor to the modern state auditor. And the first comptroller's duties were to direct the mode of stating, checking, and controlling all public accounts, and to keep these accounts for inspection by the General Assembly. And then the Office of the State Treasurer was created to handle public money. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of overlap and similarity in the type of record created by these two offices. And when these records came to us in the 1920s, the papers from the Treasurer's office and the Comptroller's office were so intermingled at transfer, and the type of record created by each office was so similar in nature that it was really difficult to distinguish and separate out papers from the two offices. Therefore, the archivist made the decision to process the papers together as a single group, the Treasurer's and Comptroller's papers. Now, this was a collection that really hadn't been touched from a description or preservation and housing standpoint since the 1960s. It had an unwieldy finding aid containing outdated language. There was a lack of description for some series, whereas others contained overly detailed indexes down to the page number for some of the volumes. The records were also housed in old manuscript boxes, as you can see on this slide, which had now become a preservation concern for us. And at the same time, we had also recently migrated data to a new collections management system, Axiom, and the data from the legacy finding aid really didn't easily translate well into our new system. The Treasurers and Comptrollers Papers is a heavily used, frequently cited collection, which we anticipated would only get more use and attention with our upcoming America 250th programming. Therefore, to facilitate access and discovery with our new content management system and online catalog, as well as best ensure preservation of these important records over time, we embarked on a project to reprocess and redescribe the Treasurers and Comptrollers Papers. Now, we had been aware of the discovery issues this collection presented and the fact that the records would need to be rehoused eventually. But the main impetus behind the reprocessing project was really our upcoming America 250th programming. And with this, there was a real focus on records from the time of the American Revolution. We also had departmental goals of conscious description and increasing visibility for underrepresented groups in our holdings. So with these departmental goals and initiatives in mind, we really wanted to take a more inclusive and social history-inspired approach and really think about the groups and people who may have been excluded from the previous bicentennial programming and celebrations in which these records may have been used. Now, on the outside, a collection containing primarily financial records may seem rather dull, but we actually saw this as an opportunity, and we embraced this reprocessing project as a way to increase visibility for individuals who may have been hidden in the 1960s legacy description. And we wanted to be able to include them in America 250th outreach and programming, as well as digitization initiatives. And one of the things that we really thought about was that this idea that financial records are a place where you could encounter individuals who might not otherwise be leaving many archival traces. So I think a good example would be enslaved persons or enslaved laborers, or maybe day laborers who could only leave their mark rather than a signature. And these likely aren't the people who are leaving behind the correspondence and the diaries in our private collections. But they participated in the economy, and so they show up in financial records like pay vouchers, receipts, and accounts. Now, going into this project, we had expected to uncover some records related to enslaved persons and other underrepresented groups. But when we got into the processing, we were really surprised by the breadth and the depth that we encountered throughout this series. And we're going to talk a little more about this on our section with Hidden Histories. But first, Caroline's going to talk more in depth about some of our reprocessing workflows and logistics.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Waller. I'm the Digital Records Description Archivist here at the State Archives of North Carolina. Alex and I, we worked very closely on this project, so I feel at this point with this presentation, we kind of have the same brain of how we think about the series or this record group. But before we could get started processing, we needed a better understanding of the scope of this project. So first, we conducted a survey of each of the 44 series in the record group, and you can see a portion of this survey on the slide. One of the big things we needed to do with the survey is to gather data on what was actually on the shelf and then what's in our content management system, Axiom. So since this was an older and legacy collection, it's been through several different migrations from different databases, there was a lot of inconsistencies. Also with this survey, we noted the physical locations of the materials, the arrangement, any potential conservation issues that we noticed, like environmental concerns. Also, one of our bigger concerns was oversized materials that were stuffed into boxes that were too small. There was a lot of unfolded materials that were kind of shoved in boxes and then, were getting shuffled around over the years. And then also we took note of volumes that were stored in these boxes because we wanted to pull these out and store them as volumes to increase access in the future. Also, since we're preparing for A250, we surveyed each series for potential value for A250 programming, and then just made any general observations about how we can increase access in the future. But armed with the data from this survey, we created a reboxing prioritization list. We quickly realized that we wanted to rebox all of these series before we fully reprocessed them, because honestly, we didn't know how long reprocessing would take, and there were some conservation concerns with these older boxes. So using the data from the survey, we created a prioritization list. So we ranked each series in terms of which ones were the most urgent to rebox. Also, we decided to rebox the series that we thought were really simple, that any staff member could do without more training. And then the really complicated series, we went ahead and either slated for digitization or we took them back to our offices for immediate reprocessing. Okay, and now Alex, she's going to talk a little bit more in depth about the workflows with this project.
So normally, reboxing, like refoldering, is part of the physical processing and arrangement step. But in this case, reboxing the whole of the collection really became the first step due to preservation issues identified by our conservation staff. And it really became this all-hands-on-deck situation. We had to get the material out of the old manuscript boxes as soon as possible. So what we did is we designed a workflow to prioritize speed and efficiency and also eliminate processing decisions. And we've included the workflow on our slide. I know it's a little bit small writing, but if anyone's interested, just email us. We're happy to share it. And part of the reason why we really wanted to eliminate processing decisions was because we didn't want to have inconsistencies. We had colleagues all across the archives helping us from like the various different divisions. And so this workflow allowed us to bring in colleagues from other divisions, like say our records analysts, who weren't processing archivists. So we couldn't assume that they were familiar with our unit's workflows and processing. And one of the important things about the survey was that it helped us identify what someone might encounter and then not know what to do when they came across the records. So as Caroline mentioned, we identified oversized records, loose records, and volumes. And in our workflow, we gave very specific instructions on what to do in each of these situations. Now, I think it's really important to emphasize that we knew that archivists were coming by afterwards to process each series. So with this workflow, we were really just focusing on the most important aspect, which was getting materials out of the old manuscript boxes and into modern archival boxes. So refoldering and other types of things could happen later. And then we were making sure we documented where everything came from. So with the workflow itself, we worked series by series. We worked in two-person teams, led by a records description archivist, and you can see the sign-up sheet on the left there, where we had our colleagues from other divisions signing up to assist us with this. We worked 2-hour shifts and 1 shift per day, and essentially what we were doing is moving records from the old manuscript boxes into the modern archival boxes, and then we recorded each folder into a crosswalk, which you can see an example of on this slide. Now, this crosswalk was a really important step for us, because we discovered that material from multiple manuscript boxes would fit into a single modern manuscript box. And we really needed to make sure that we had this crosswalk so we could link citations from the old legacy finding aid to the newly reboxed records. This reboxing process took about 3 months, but during this whole 3 months, these records were available. So if patrons came into the search room, we had to make sure that we could help reference staff locate them. In total, we reboxed 517 manuscript boxes. And then on this slide here, you can see a timeline of our various phases, the survey, the reboxing, and the processing phase. As you can see, the survey took a little over 4 months. We managed to accomplish the rehousing in 3 months. And then there were the reprocessing of the various series. They spanned over a year, and the process is still ongoing. And you'll note that there's a lot of overlap between the various phases and also the series that were being processed. And that's because this was really a group processing project. So we had multiple people working on various aspects throughout. And so to manage this group processing project, I served as the project manager, and Caroline was the one who did a lot of the physical processing and arrangement work. I think communication and organization were really important for keeping us all on track. Caroline and I held regular meetings. We also sent constant email communication to make sure we were all on the same page. We also used a variety of methods to keep track of our progress at the various points. On this slide here, you can see an example of our processing status board. We use that to track, our progress for each series, like what had been done, what was still in progress. And I think this would allow us to sort of scale up if we mostly just had Caroline and me working on the 2 series, but we could have brought in more people with using this processing survey status board. I also managed a high-level processing plan. And then for each series, we created individual processing plans for those series. And typically, Caroline would write the processing plans, and I would review them, and then the 2 of us would meet and discuss. And then another important thing we used to keep track was the crosswalk. As I've mentioned before, this was a legacy collection that has been heavily cited. So it was really important that we could locate reprocessed records based on the old citations. And for the reprocessing crosswalk, in some cases, we were able to use the crosswalk that we had from reboxing, but in other cases, things might have changed boxes additionally. So we would update what we had from the reboxing crosswalk into this reprocessing crosswalk. And this became especially important because we ended up having to change call numbers in some situations. And so for our approach to processing, what we were really doing was evaluating each series and asking what is the minimum that needs to be done to make this accessible and discoverable. And we found that this really varied series by series. We embraced this idea of levels of processing, so it's this idea that not every series needs to be processed to the same degree of granularity. And we were really just for each series thinking, what is necessary for discovery and access? And we discovered that not everything needed a file level description. So for example, we have the series of the Revolutionary War pay vouchers. In this situation, everything was a pay voucher. It was all arranged alphabetically. So in this situation, an item level or a folder level description really doesn't increase discovery. We found that, a really strong, robust scope and content note could convey the information that we needed to patrons. And then I think you could contrast this with, say, the miscellaneous group. This is something where a folder level description really does increase access and discovery. And this is the approach we take for most state agency processing projects. But I think what was unique about this project was the America 250th considerations. So if a series spanned the Revolutionary War era, we actually gave it extra attention during processing to identify groups, individuals, or stories that may have been excluded previously. And I think this is what I really mean when I talk about our social history-inspired approach. This is something that was built into the processing plan, like refoldering or handling oversized materials. And then, especially when we encountered references to enslaved persons, we definitely made sure that we did a closer review of the materials during processing. Now, this isn't something that we normally do, but again, America 250th and conscious description considerations really played into these decisions. And I think this approach was really what allowed us to uncover what we're calling our hidden narratives. And now Caroline's going to present a bit on some of our hidden narrative series.
So behind me on the slide, this is the processing plan we had for the port series. It actually looks a little bit blurry on the big screen. But the port series was one of the first we selected to process because we knew this was slated for immediate digitization. We decided to process this series to a more granular level of detail because it contains some of the oldest materials that we have here at the archives, dating from 1682 to 1882. This series contains the records of North Carolina's colonial and early American ports, records which provide some of the most robust evidence of maritime transatlantic and transamerican trafficking of enslaved persons through our ports during the 18th century. In the past, historians have used the series to historicize slavery, and it's been published about, but we don't have any mention of this subject in the legacy finding aid or in the original catalog. A little background on previous processing of this series. It was originally arranged and processed in 1961 and 1962, and it hasn't been updated for over 60 years. There was a finding aid prepared in 1994, which you can see on the screen, but from what we can tell, there were minor edits. There wasn't any major changes made from the 1962 processing. But we identified this series as a hidden series, in that the title and the legacy folder titles did not really give us an understanding of what's actually in the series. We decided to do a folder level description while also adding a more robust description to the series with an updated scope and content note. An example of one of these hidden narratives or hidden histories that we found in this series is part of the record we have on the screen. This is a record of the Lake Company, who trafficked 80 enslaved Africans from West Africa in June of 1786 for the purpose of hand-digging the Dismal Swamp Canal. So we have documentation of this event across several of our volumes in this series. You can see on the screen, it shows that 80 enslaved Africans arrived at Port Roanoke on the brig Camden on June 10th, 1786. We also know that the brig Camden returned to Africa and then came back to Edenton in March of 1787 with 70 more enslaved persons. But while I was reprocessing the port series, we counted over 946 enslaved persons that were trafficked through our ports between 1773 and 1789. Of course, we know this is an incomplete record of how many enslaved persons were trafficked through our ports, often coming from other American colonies or states, some from the Caribbean or West Africa. But with this reprocessing project, we've enhanced the description of this series to illuminate these records, which I think is one of the first steps to increasing access and awareness that we have these materials. Currently, these records are undergoing digitization, and they should be available in our digital catalog within a week or two. Another unique series that we encountered with this reprocessing project is the Revolutionary Army Account series. This series contains different types of Revolutionary War account books. mostly relating to certificates or vouchers for war and post-war militia service, or for supplies and provisions for the Continental Forces. There are 43 volumes in this series, but the portion of the legacy finding aid for just this series was over 100 pages long. And that's because each of these volumes had an essay historicizing and describing each volume. And while we find this information incredibly invaluable to researchers, it made it really difficult to navigate the legacy finding aid and kind of find what you needed in the collection. Also, there were out-of-date call numbers for each of these volumes. There were several iterations of call numbers all over the 60-plus years history of the collection. So with this description, we decided to summarize each volume, edit it down a little bit, while also referring back to the legacy finding aid, which is digitized and available in our digital collections, and refer back to the original call number. So you can see on the screen here, on one side is the first page of the essay for book, I think it's book A in the legacy finding aid. This was a several page long essay. And then in the 2023 finding aid, you can see there's a short paragraph just summarizing this volume and then referring back to the legacy finding aid. Here's the catalog record of that same book. You can see in the legacy finding aid that it was originally book A, then eventually it becomes volume 40. It was split into two, so very confusing. But in the 2023 finding aid, we have individual call numbers for each volume, but of course referring back to the original book A call number. Another issue with this series is there is an index of every single name found in these books, and there's over 62,000 entries in our catalog. This makes Axiom really difficult to navigate, so currently we're working on moving this index to our indexing module so that the catalog and the finding aid are more user-friendly. The Lands, Estates, Boundaries, and Surveys series is an example of what we thought was a pretty straightforward series that would require minimal processing, but once we actually started processing, we realized quickly that we needed to rethink our processing plan. And that's because a lot of these property records actually include enslaved persons as property. The confiscated land records is where we found a lot of enslaved persons listed as property. The confiscated land records, they were property. This discusses property that belonged to loyalists that was confiscated by the state during and after the Revolutionary War. And during processing, we found that it was important to, I guess, be flexible in our processing plan, and we worked hard to, further describe the collection with a more updated scope and content note. And here's an example of some of those documents that show enslaved persons listed as property. Alex already touched on the miscellaneous group. There were actually two miscellaneous series in the Treasurer and Comptroller's papers. One is this one. This was all of the miscellaneous loose records that we had. There was also a miscellaneous volume series. We don't really typically like having a series that's called miscellaneous. It's not very descriptive. However, we decided that since these series have a long history of being researched, being cited, that we decided to keep the title miscellaneous. However, we did know it was important to have a more robust description. So we did an itemized description, and then we also updated the language because the language from the 1960s doesn't meet our current conscious description standards. Also, we found that this series contains some pretty upsetting records that we think are important to highlight as a hidden history. These are the records pertaining to the magistrates and freeholders' courts. These were special courts erected to try and convict enslaved persons in the 1700s. And these records discuss the executions of enslaved persons, including discussion of trial proceedings and certifications of execution, which were forwarded to the North Carolina General Assembly's Committee of Claims so that the enslaver could receive monetary compensation for their enslaved labor that was executed. You can see an example of one of these certificates on the screen. This particular certificate is discussing the execution of enslaved men by the names of Davy and Will, probably around 1738. And you can see that it mentions their enslaver, mentions their names, and then also whatever value was paid in compensation to the enslaver for their execution. With this series, we knew it was really important to update our language to meet, conscious description standards. Also, we wanted to historicize what these courts were So we made sure to include that in the scope and content note. And then also, since this is such upsetting material, we included a content warning at the top. And now Alex is going to talk a little bit about the Capitol Building series.
So the Capitol Building series contains records concerning the building, maintenance, upkeep, and furnishing of government buildings in North Carolina's state capitol. And with this series, the original description listed a few folder titles and volume titles that referenced enslaved labor. So for example, there was a folder called State Capitol, Laborers' Pay and Enslaved Labor. But during processing, what we discovered was that references and documentation of the labor of enslaved persons was actually scattered throughout all of the folders in this series. And you can see here with the Legacy Finding Aid, it doesn't really have a scope and content for this specific series, but one of the things we made sure was for the scope and content note for this series, we really wanted to mention that there were the references to enslaved labor in all of the folders, or most of them. So that way, when patrons came into the search room, they would know to look in the whole of the series instead of just those few folders that in the legacy description specifically called it out. And then I have some examples from this. In this first one, the original folder title was just called State House, Pay Claims, Warrants, and Receipts. But in this receipt, we actually see that John G. Marshall received $19.45 in full for the hire of Peter the Carpenter for 1 month repairs of the State House in the month of August. And we can see in this example that Peter actually had a skilled trade as a carpenter. And this next example is from a folder that was entitled State Capitol, Clearing Debris of State House. And in this one, we can see that Augustus Mordecai was paid $9.20 in full for labor done by Squire on the State House Square. And this was in April of 1833. And then in this last example, the folder title was State House Union Square Well. And this folder contained materials related to work done for the creation of a well in Union Square, which is where the old State House was. And in this example, we see that Ned's enslaver, William Peck, received $3 for Ned's labor cutting down weeds and grass and piling the same in the public square for 4 days. Now, I think this Capitol Building series provides one of the better examples of the impact of our reprocessing so far, of how we've increased access and discovery through our redescription and outreach. And I think Ned Peck's story is a really great example of this. So in January, we were featured on our State Archives' podcast, Connecting the Dots. And in this podcast, we discussed several of the hidden narratives that we had found, including the story of Ned Peck and his labor on the Union Square well. And then in February, we participated in a webinar with researchers from the state capitol. And they were talking about their From Naming to Knowing website. And in this website, they had researched and shared stories of the enslaved men who labored to build and maintain the state capitol. And one of the men that they had actually researched and featured on their website was Ned Peck. And so with our outreach with the podcast and this webinar, we were actually able to connect the state capitol researchers with the document that records Ned's work on the Union Square well. And so now more has been added to his story on this From Naming to Knowing website, and they actually feature this record that discusses his work on the well. And so we're also hoping to put them in touch with even more documents and information on enslaved laborers that are mentioned in our records. So I think that this here is a really great example of how our work has led to increased access and discovery of some of these hidden narratives. And then another impact of this reprocessing is our expansion of our Enslaved Persons Project Names spreadsheet, which I'll turn it over to Caroline to discuss.
The Enslaved Persons Names Project spreadsheet is currently an internal document where we add any information we discover about enslaved persons that we find while processing government records. This project began in 2019 as a county record project, but as we were getting into TNC, we realized that we needed to expand this project so that we included all types of government records. This spreadsheet documents several different data points, including the folder in which the document was found, the date of the record, the county when available, the name of the enslaved person, the name of the enslavers or any third parties, and then any additional information. So as you can see on the slide, sometimes the enslaved person is listed with their families. Sometimes there's information about, what their occupation is or what they do, what their relative ages are. And with the Treasurer and Comptroller's Papers Rehousing Project, we've added 628 entries to this spreadsheet. But we're hoping to continue to do this work. We've identified several series that we want to continue to go through on a more granular level, hopefully with the hope of an intern this summer. And currently, if you're interested in this spreadsheet, we're happy to provide it as a resource to patrons or researchers, and we're still exploring new ways to continue to do this type of work and provide this data to the public. The Treasurers and Comptrollers Papers Rehousing and Reprocessing Project is one of the first steps in modernizing our collections. We are the first to admit that there are unique limitations for innovation in government archives. But we want to continue to explore and engage with the current direction of work being done in the archival field on topics such as conscious description and decolonization. During this project, we had to balance doing this type of work with the fact that TNC is a legacy collection that has been frequently cited and used in research. Also, we want to acknowledge that this is an artificially arranged collection from the 1960s, so we couldn't really rely on original order when it came to our arrangement decisions. But what we were able to do was to adjust the lens that we're using to think about and describe this collection. This is a collection of financial papers, but we want to illuminate that these are financial papers that speak to and are undergirded with the fact that they are documenting an economy structured around enslaved labor. So this collection contains critical materials that help us understand really basic and important things about North Carolina's economy during the 17th to the 19th centuries. Again, we want to illuminate and pull the veil away from these narratives. These are financial records, but they reveal how deeply slavery was embedded in North Carolina's economic system. They also reveal the different layers of how enslaved labor interacted with the government. So you saw the example of how enslavers hired out enslaved laborers to work on the state capitol, or the example of the government's involvement with the public improvement projects such as the Dismal Swamp Canal. The ultimate goal of this project is to make it clear to researchers that this collection is more than just numbers. These records are extremely important to documenting North Carolina's past and creating a more inclusive historical record. There are several hidden narratives that we have not had a chance to explore yet, and this includes the American Indian experience, and we know that there's a lot of discussion of this in the Treasurer and Comptroller's papers. We also hope to continue to do this work with this collection and others. Again, this is an ongoing project, and we hope to continue to build on this initial work. Thank you, everyone, for listening to our presentation this morning. Now we're going to hand the mic to Annabeth, and she's going to talk about her wonderful work that she's been doing with the Connecting the Docs podcast, and also how she's been uncovering hidden histories as well.
So hi, as Josh said earlier, my name is Annabeth Poe, and I serve as the Assistant Oral Historian here at the State Archives. Last summer, I served as the podcast intern. I graduated in December with my master's in public history from NC State. However, my background is in broadcast journalism. With public history, I'm always looking for ways to use different forms of media to tell important historical stories, which made this internship absolutely perfect for me. I'm excited to be here today to share with you my work on Connecting the Docs, True Stories from the Old North State, the State Archives podcast, which you should all go listen to, follow, rate, all of the things. So I want to start off today by introducing Connecting the Docs and walking you through the process of what it looks like to create an archival podcast. Then I plan to underline why podcasting is an important tool for public historians and archivists to use to connect with the public. I will end by showcasing one of the series I worked on while interning at the archives, which I think embodies Connecting the Docs' strength and goals overall. Connecting the Docs, True Stories from the Old North State began in 2019 as a digital podcasting project. The first season consisted of 9 episodes, approximately 30 minutes each, all focused on true and infamous crime stories from across the state. Details were drawn from the archive's records, which in turn inspired discussions between the season's hosts, archive staff, and special guests about how archival records can help tell important historical stories from the past. While the podcast had initial success, production stopped in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in 2021, the show returned with the same general format and goal, to use archival sources to tell North Carolina's stories, but with a new focus, painting a broader picture of North Carolina's past beyond true crime and explaining history's relevance today. So the big question is, how do you make an archival podcast? Connecting the Docs production follows a general order of operations that reflects broader podcasting standards. As the podcast intern, I had the opportunity to participate in every step of this process, which I'll briefly walk through now. The first step is picking a topic. When I started my internship, the topics for season 4 had already been decided, and you can see them listed here on the screen. The episodes aligned with the podcast's overall goal to welcome people into the archives by telling stories and explaining archival procedures, which were incredibly important in the series specifically. The second step is research, both within the archive's collections and in secondary sources. This helps create an inventory of what documents are available, in what formats, and helps pare down what can be used in an episode to create an accurate and engaging story. It also creates a unique opportunity to put records from different collections in conversations with each other in a new and exciting way. Third, outlining and scripting helps ensure consistency in creating a coherent story with a beginning, middle, and end. It is the most important step of the podcast process because of the need to explain and describe everything in detail so it makes sense auditorily. This is specifically important with written records because you have to describe the look, feel, and language of the written document so listeners can imagine the record. As it is discussed, in addition to understanding its context and role in the research process. For connecting the docs, this step also involves writing a brief tease for the beginning of the episode. The next step is recording the episode. This entails finding a quiet space, setting up microphones, watching audio levels, and checking microphone volumes to ensure a clear and precise sound. This season, we also had the opportunity to step out of the studio, and we recorded one of the episodes celebrating the Year of the Trail directly on the Mountains to Sea Trail, which you can see on the slide. The fifth step is editing the audio into a coherent episode by removing unrelated asides and checking for accuracy and narrative consistency. For us, it also means adding a commercial to advertise new archives initiatives as well as new programming. The last step is publishing and publicizing the shows. Connecting the Docs is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, basically wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe. Episodes are also featured on the State Archives blog called History for All the People. The blog automatically posts to social media and provides a link to the episode, as well as episode notes that attribute sources and briefly describe the episode. Before describing my internship, it is important to note that Connecting the Docs has a unique place within the archive's internal structure. Unlike public outreach and social media content, which have dedicated staff, the podcast is spearheaded by a team of representatives from several archival sections. This includes outreach and development, special collections and reference, digital access, and records description units. The state oral historian leads the team in monthly meetings to discuss upcoming episodes and topics for future ones, which are usually decided up to 6 months in advance. While this collaborative approach does help demystify the archive's work overall and creates no shortage of ideas, it also means that there is no one working on the podcast full-time. My internship, which was the first of its kind, made me the podcast's first full-time producer, helping ensuring consistency and clarity across season 4. Connecting the Docs True Stories from the Old North State represents an attempt to increase access to the state archives of North Carolina by using podcasting to teach people about state history. At the same time, the episodes demystify both the historical research process and archival work to invite listeners to explore the record collections for themselves. Because of this dual mission, Connecting the Docs is uniquely situated to bridge the gap between institutions and the public by interpreting records and research through the human voice. This allows the archives as an institution and the records to speak. The hosts and episode guests have a unique position of authority, but also can maintain both authenticity and transparency because of the nature of podcasting as a digital medium. This increases the podcast's overall impact as it seeks to excite people about history and inspire them to do historical research. Connecting the Dots educates, entertains, and invites people into the archives, embodying broader questions of the role in podcasts in public education, outreach, and their future effects. However, this attempt is ultimately successful because Connecting the Dots combines traditional storytelling methods and new media accessibility in its dual mission. My work on the Unexpected Story series for the 4th season of the show represents this relationship and underlines Connecting the Dots' importance for public historians and archivists moving forward. So I spent a majority of my internship working on the Unexpected Story series, which serves as season 4's finale. The Unexpected Story series centers on unexpected records archivists' staff uncovered while working on other projects. These episodes closely align with the podcast's overarching goal of connecting people to the archives by telling historical stories while also explaining archival practices. For example, this series was partly inspired by new initiatives centered on ongoing conscious description efforts or the process of updating metadata to reflect the content of collections more accurately and appropriately, as well as confronting archival silences. This is best represented in the series' theme. It reads, "These episodes are part of a series where we uncover stories from the archives that have rarely been acknowledged. Each in some way represents profound strength within a system that constantly failed to recognize women and people of color for their contributions to the state of North Carolina. Now we tell their stories." This gave each podcast its ultimate structure. Each episode begins with a story of how the records were uncovered, continues by detailing the record stories in historical context, and ends with broader discussions about how the archives can do better in the future to correct silences overall through an accessible and layered storytelling approach. For this series, I helped construct this consistent message, researched the content, outlined and scripted episodes, served as a guest and guest host, and edited 2 of the episodes in their entirety. As a case study, the Unexpected Story series highlights the strengths of Connecting the Dots overall. One episode of the Unexpected Story series centers on a letter written by Ruthie Jackson, a woman living in Hillsborough in 1781. Years prior, she had given birth to a daughter named Nancy, who was the product of Jackson's affair with General Francis Nash. Nash, the namesake of Nash County, North Carolina, and Nashville, Tennessee, was a Revolutionary War hero, even leading men into battle alongside George Washington. However, by 1781, Nash had died, leaving Nancy without a father. Further, as Ruthie Jackson's health failed, she knew her daughter would be left orphaned. This led her to write a letter to a judge in eastern North Carolina named John Williams, who was Francis Nash's longtime friend, asking him to adopt Nancy after she died. Caitlin Martell, a former member of the Digital Access Branch, found the letter by chance while she was digitizing the John Williams Military Collection at the State Archives. The letter was completely absent from the finding aid, despite detailed entries for the other documents within the collection. This made it the perfect story to include in the Unexpected Story series. Together, Caitlin and I researched the letter and attempted to determine what happened to Ruthie Jackson and Nancy, highlighting their stories after decades in the shade of the Nash family legacy. The podcast form followed the aforementioned Unexpected Story series structure. Caitlin began the episode by describing her experience uncovering the letter and expressed her shock at its lack of acknowledgement, which she attributes to social conventions biased against unwed mothers. This became the historical undercurrent to the story as we searched the archives for Ruthie Jackson and Nancy. Personally, this process led me to explore different collections within the archives that in many ways trace the untraceable. These are collections of legal bonds, specifically bastardy bonds, guardian bonds, and apprentice bonds, which feature information about children on the edge of social bounds that may not be mentioned by name, and other contemporaneous records such as censuses and tax records. The search for Ruthie Jackson and Nancy also led me to one of North Carolina's most unique collections, a series of British government financial records available through microfilm that date back to the 1500s. While we found some surprises, which you'll have to listen to the podcast to hear about, Caitlin and I struggled to correctly answer the question of what happened to Ruthie Jackson and Nancy. This led us to make our research process a key element of the podcast story. This lack of material meant filling in the gaps, not just with historical context, but with a clear understanding of where we looked and why, to help demystify our work. For example, Caitlin described her research process as she completed what she calls genealogical calculus, or using census records to determine age distribution to showcase someone's movements over time. In this case, she used people's birthdays to attempt to determine if John Williams actually adopted Nancy after receiving the letter. The episode ends with Caitlin describing her new finding aid, which now includes the letter and the letter's digitization to ensure that it is not buried again. We further invited listeners to hunt for Ruthie Jackson and Nancy themselves. The Ruthie Jackson podcast, as the first unexpected story series recorded, thus became the blueprint for the other episodes, where I participated less in active research and more on behind-the-scenes production. And just to tease again, if you want to know what we find, listen to the podcast. The second episode of the series focused on the state's use of enslaved labor for public projects using financial information from the Treasurer's and Comptroller's papers, which you just heard about from Caroline and Alex. As experts attuned to the nuances of dealing with government records, Caroline and Alex, along with Josh, who helped facilitate our connections and conversations, worked with me to help construct the episode structure and theme. Unlike with the Ruthie Jackson letter episode, I did not participate in any of the TNC research, so I really relied on their expertise and collaboration during the writing process. The TNC episode begins with Caroline and Alex describing the papers and projects that drew them to the collection to begin with, mirroring the Ruthie Jackson episode. Just as a reminder, some of these projects centered on correcting the finding aid, which had no mention of the presence of enslaved people on public work sites, and on creating a database of enslaved people in the archive's records to aid future genealogical research. However, after their initial uncovering, formatting the rest of the episode posed a challenge. Unlike the Ruthie Jackson letter episode, which was narrative over time, both in the 1700s and throughout the research process, the TNC story was much more thematic. This resulted in a tiered storytelling approach, where Alex and Caroline could first describe their general findings across the collection by highlighting its complicated layers before moving on to specific stories and specific records. For example, the first half of the episode featured a group discussion about two public projects built by enslaved people, the Capitol Building and the Great Dismal Swamp Canal. The second half zoomed in by describing skilled labor positions for enslaved workers, paid work on Sundays, and families who were listed together. Across the episode, a narrowing narrative structure was key in ensuring that people could follow the development of enslaved labor and its changing characteristics over time. This would in turn help people access these online resources about the TNC papers that Caroline and Alex mentioned, as well as encourage them to come by and view the collection for further research projects relating to state history and genealogy overall. For the third and final episode in the Unexpected Story series, I not only outlined and scripted the show, but also served as the guest host. The episode, which describes cases of manumission brought before the General Assembly, consists of an interview with fellow State Archives intern Hannah Nicholson, who spent the summer creating a library guide about women and people of color's presence in the legislature's records during the Revolutionary period. Like with the TNC papers, I had not done any of the research components for the episode. However, Hannah already had a rough structure in mind. By the time we met, she had already selected two manumission petitions that naturally helped divide the episode into two distinct yet related story center halves. These were the stories of Hannah Bowers and Ned Griffin. To briefly summarize, Hannah Bowers was an enslaved woman who worked for the Gaston family of state notoriety at their plantation in New Bern. She was freed through a General Assembly petition submitted by Margaret Gaston, whose husband Alexander had promised to free Bowers, but died before he followed through. Ned Griffin was an enslaved man who fought in the American Revolution in place of the man who purchased him for the promise of freedom. However, after the war, the man refused to abide by their deal, so Griffin, with the support and testimony of his fellow Revolutionary War soldiers, successfully petitioned the General Assembly for his freedom. Despite several brief meetings with Hannah and writing the outline, I had no prior knowledge of the details of either story until I interviewed her about her research. This is an important aspect for connecting the dots, as during every recording, there is at least one person in the room with limited knowledge of the episode to ensure clarity and that the story translation makes sense overall. In the cases of manumission, having little to no prior experience about the topic allowed me to ask better questions to help aid listener understanding. I was able to connect Hannah's research to my own on the Civil War, making even more broad historical connections to build out the story's environment. We ended the episode by advertising Hannah's guide before discussing our experience at the archives during the summer and our future plans. Overall, my work at the State Archives of North Carolina on the Unexpected Story series, specifically in the podcast Connecting the Dots more generally, directly represents the podcast's dual mission to teach people about state history while demystifying archival work. The podcast, through its combination of storytelling techniques and digital accessibility, can model an effective way for public historians and archivists to connect to the public and invite their participation in research. Connecting the dots by providing a space where the archives and records can speak is uniquely situated to bridge the gap between institutions and the public. I want to end my presentation like we end every episode with an outro. Thank you all for joining me today, and thank you for listening to Connecting the Dots, and don't forget to subscribe. I have really enjoyed this presentation, and stay tuned for more stories from the State Archives. I'm Annabeth Poe.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We've got a few minutes for questions if we have any, and also I should ask if there's any that come in through Zoom. Yeah, okay, we've got a bunch of hands over here. We'll start making my way around.
This is not really a question, it's more of a comment and suggestion for Caroline and Alex. And first, my comment is just, I want to express empathy. My entire collection is in those flat boxes, and I'm reprocessing my entire collection right now. So you are not alone and in that endeavor and in that experience. And then in terms of sharing your name database for the enslaved persons, a few people in the room know me and know what I'm about to say. I would recommend Airtable as a device platform to import your spreadsheet into, and then you can embed that, and it can be searchable on a website. So if you ever want to talk about Airtable, I'm here for you. My name is Megan O'Riordan. I'm the archivist for the Moravians in the Southern Province in Winston-Salem. So just you have my empathy for your project and your endeavors.
Thank you. I saw another hand.
I have a spreadsheet question. Would you guys share your beautiful spreadsheets and project tracking? Or I guess one of my questions is, what software did you use to sort of lay out the series processing for the Treasurer and Comptroller's records?
So we actually just used like the Microsoft Office suite. I had a high-level processing plan that was like, it was basically a Microsoft Word document, but it was kind of like, okay, this is my plan for the series, like the general project plan. And then everything else was done in Excel. So that was what we used for our tracking spreadsheet. Yeah, I think the processing status board that I mentioned, that was what we used for our survey spreadsheet. I think, and a crosswalk, that was, sorry, I'm trying to remember all the different documentations we had, and that's also what we used for our crosswalk. And we're happy to share, the templates for any of them. I think our email addresses were on the PowerPoint, but certainly reach out to us. We can, you may need to make some changes because you might be dealing with, slightly different issues, but I think it worked pretty well. The processing status board really helped Caroline and I see, okay, like we've done everything for these volumes, but some of them are in conservation awaiting custom housing, so we haven't finished barcoding these. And then we could mark that as like, ongoing. But then when other things were completed, we kind of, changed color, I think, for the processing status board. And then the processing plans were all done in Microsoft Word.
I have a follow-up question. Did you consider using something like Trello, like a project management software, or was Excel just so like bread and butter for you that you were like, obviously we're gonna do this in Excel?
I guess, Caroline, you can feel free to jump in at any point. I think for me, we use Excel so much. With our content management system, Axiom, we're actually able to import our container lists through Excel. We also just have like a shared network drive too, like, working for the government. So we had like a separate folder that was specifically treasurers and comptrollers reprocessing. We had a different folder for like storing the processing plans. I think I wasn't sure about having like an outside like I think Trello is outside. I'm not sure if we have like a government subscription to that. So I tried to just keep everything, it was on the shared drive. So if, for some reason, something happened and someone had to take over the project, like all of the data was there, anyone could access it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and just using Excel, I think it worked really well just because it was just the two of us, but if it was a more expansive project with more staff members, I'm sure there are other tools out there that we could have utilized. So if anyone has any suggestions, like we're happy to hear those.
Saw some hands over here. Yes, right here.
This is a question for Annabeth. As you were looking for space to record the podcast and kind of set that up, did you already have space available, or what did it look like to acquire that space, set up that space?
So for several of our podcasts, we've used spaces within the archives. So we've just rented those out, basically just been like, we're going to record here at this time, this day, whatever. But we actually got contacted with someone in DNCR, like higher up. And they told us about a space at the Science Museum, which is a full radio studio. So the photo that was in the slideshow of us recording was actually in that studio. It's a old WUNC studio that I think they still use sometimes, but it's pretty available most of the time. So we've been starting to record more and more there just because it's soundproofed and it's a lot better it saves time in post-production of editing out like air conditioning sounds and all of those wonderful things. So yeah.
Other questions? Anything online? No? Yes, we have a question down here.
Hello, I have a question about the enslaved, basically deed stuff. So I work with the Digital Library of American Slavery over at UNCG, and I was wondering if you had worked with them or had gotten in contact with them about maybe taking some of those entries and getting them on the Digital Library of American Slavery for easy access.
We haven't contacted them yet. This is still kind of in the early stages. We definitely want to grow the data that we have. I think our main goal with this is really publicizing that there are these names in state agency records, because I think a lot of people maybe go to estates or different records. I don't think a lot of people think of the treasurers and comptrollers papers as a really rich resource for them.
Great. Unless I see any other hands right now, I don't. We are at time anyway, so join me in thanking them for this session.